Hi, this is the fellow passenger speaking. First of all, I would like to give a shout out to Shaw Tokura, who has signed up to the mid-tier of my Patreon. And now we're going to talk about this video. This is the second episode of my 6-week of recording an album challenge. In the previous episode, I set out a rough plan for the coming weeks. And I've been looking at sound design during the past week. And before I go into any further detail how these sounds were made, here's a quick glimpse of what I have been making. The reasoning behind focusing on sound design before compositions are: a new sound palette tends to inspire me to compose something that is quite different from what I've done in the past. The other thing is, having a sound palette created specifically for the project should help me create a coherent feeling for the album. And designing sounds also helped me getting into the vibe. A bit like the Pinterest board I talked about in the previous video that I've created dedicated for this project. If you missed the previous video, I'll put a link in the description in below, both to the video and the Pinterest board. And in the same way, I treat it rather loosely, and it's more about capturing a feeling. The other thing is also, like, by doing the sound design now does by no means stop me from keeping designing sounds further down the line if I see fit. Anyway, did it all go to plan? Well, maybe, sort of. I will reflect a bit on the process as we go through this video, but I've also decided that I will make an additional episode after the 6 weeks where I will just review the process, doing a bit of mopping up. What did I find good, and what would I like to change for next time? I've also decided that all my mid and top tier Patreons will be able to download the full album for free, the one that I will be making through this process. And it will be available to them before it's available to download from anywhere else. Anyway, let's start going through the process of making these sounds. And I ended up with over 1,500 samples. It's probably more close to 1,700. And you can get access to all of these and use them in your music as you see fit without any further permission via my Patreon. But more about that later in the video. In this process, I decided to focus on a few specific instruments just to help me, or rather stop me from just sprawling and losing time just trying to use absolutely everything I have at my disposal. When working on the modular, I tend to start somewhere with some loose intentions. Let's say making a beat. I'll set up a patch for a beat to get something going, usually starting off fairly boring. But then as I patch and tweak, I eventually end up somewhere interesting. However, just as quickly as a good sounding patch appears, you suddenly lose it. The good bits tend to come and go, so the best thing for me is to hit record and then keep the best bits afterwards. It's generally safer to go multi-channel if you can, so if you have multiple sound sources, oscillators or whatever they may be, record them separately, because you might get some right and some not so much, and it will be easier to edit afterwards if you've done it in that way. For this project, I started off making some loops, both multi-channel recordings as well as cramming all the sounds into just one audio file. I found it quite hard to capture something that felt right. So eventually I moved on to generating a whole bunch of one-shots, which may be of more use during the next stage of the project anyway. The most noteworthy sound sources during the recording are the Noise Engineering Bassimilus Satiritos Alter, which is a digital module aimed at percussion sounds. I also used the Behringer 2600, which provides 3 single oscillators which can be operated independently. As each part of the 2600 can be treated as individual modules, this machine is pretty incredible value for money. The Blue Marvin goes for £422 brand new, and it sounds pretty damn good to my ears. I never had the privilege to work with a real ARP 2600, so I don't know how similar the sound is, but that is not so important in a way, as long as I enjoy using this one, and I do not get to use a real one, because then I would probably start lusting after one. I tried to make a patch using the ARP as the only sound source. One oscillator as a kick, one as a snare, and one as a hi-hat, well, combining it with the noise source, which is also part of the 2600. And then I used the rest of my Eurorack system to control and modulate it. I mainly used the Malaco Variegate 8 Plus for sequencing, with some help from the Variegate 4 Plus and the IntelliGel Metropolis, and I synced the modular to Ableton via a BeatStep Pro. For additional modulation, I use a Make Noise mats and a Mutable Instrument stages as envelopes, a Batumi LFO, and an SSF Div Kid sample and hold. I also use some additional voices, such as the SSF Entity Analog Percussion Module, the Erica Synths Sample Drum, Michigan Synthworks SY0.5 Analog Percussion Module, which is a sort of a clone of the Syncussion drum machine. And I also used the Klangbao Twin Peak Analog Filter, which I think sounds beautiful. For effects, I used the 4MS Resonator, the 4MS Dual Looping Delay, the Klangbao Röhren Tube VCA, which uses an old Soviet tube or valve, depending on which side of the pond you live. Creates a really nice warm distortion. And then I also used the Monsoon, which is an expanded clone of the Mutable Instrument Clouds. While I was recording the one-shots, I sent the sound source into the 4MS Matrix Mixer, allowing me to route the sound to up to 4 different paths or destinations. So I'd use that to route the sound into different effects, basically allowing me to create 4 different sounds or samples simultaneously. I have to admit, I found it somewhat difficult to capture a vibe. I've already said that, but I want to say it again. I didn't quite enjoy the modular experience as much as I've done in the past. Nevertheless, I ended up with a huge amount of sounds, which should give me a great palette to work from in the next stage of the project. I did long takes for the one-shots, and then I sliced them up into individual samples by slicing them into a MIDI track, and then I choose crop sample, which saves them out to the hard drive, and then I went to Adobe Audition to normalize them in bulk. I also discarded some samples and trimmed a few when necessary. I wasn't too religious about it, so there's probably some mistakes in there, but I think it should really help me in the next stage of the project, so I don't have to worry about those things then. The other tool that I wanted to use and was really excited to use was the Yamaha TX81z. That, on the other hand, compared to the experience with the modular, really caught the vibe for me. If you're not familiar with the Yamaha TX81z, it is a 4-operator FM synthesizer related to the more famous Yamaha DX7. This is really a sleeper. I picked one up a couple of months ago for £140. I knew I had to get one after playing around with the free VST version called Exact Light. I'll put a link in the description to it if you want to have a go. A major thing that makes it different from the DX7 though is that you can use other waveforms other than the sine waves, and they are not the usual suspects. They are weird. This is what they look like. And I haven't had that much time with it yet, actually active time using it. So during last week, I was just looking through some of the patches on there, and I have no idea who the previous owner was, but I found these UK sounding bouncy old rave patches, and I just had to do this. Let's move on. I used the Max for Live TX81Z Editor 1.1 by DTunes to create my own patches. It's really well laid out and it's making editing a breeze. The only feature that I'm really missing here is MIDI mapping. In other words, I cannot modulate the hell out of this synthesizer using the expression control, which I would normally do. I would maybe make an attempt to modify the editor when I get a bit of time. There is something about old gear, even digital stuff, like this module. It really doesn't sound like software. It has some sort of gritty immediacy. I have a theory that the vintage feel that people are so often after, that feeling that's often associated with analog synthesizers, etc., I think that mojo is less about being analog. But I'm quite keen to talk a lot more about this, and I will probably do a separate video on it and talk a bit more about sleeper gear. And yeah, let's just finish that conversation there. Now, I was meant to share some more sleeper gear with you. I mentioned this in the previous episode, but partly I ran out of time. But I also realized that those pieces of equipment makes more sense to use in the next couple of stages of the project. In other words, they are effect processors that are comparatively cheap to buy, and they are not particularly desirable, or they don't seem desirable, but I think they create really interesting results, especially for this type of music. So we will go into those more in the next coming episodes. Now I feel quite eager to move on to the next stage of the project, but before we finish, please do not forget to like and subscribe. And if you're a Patreon or you're planning to become one, you will have access to all the samples I generated. It's over 1,500, probably closer to 1,700. And to allow you insight into the process, I've also given you access to the raw recordings as well as the trimmed and normalized one-shots, so you can see if maybe you want to process them or slice them differently to what I have done. It's up to you how you want to use them. No further permission needed. And remember that the mid and top tier Patreons will get free downloads of the album once it's finished, and that will be prior to it being available from anywhere else to download. And thank you all for watching, and especially everyone who have been able to support this channel. If you're considering support, please check out the links below, and see you again soon. Thank you. Bye.